Amina Reynolds, a poised and self-assured black woman, stepped into Brighton International Airport. She wore a sleek, perfectly tailored navy blue suit paired with elegant high heels. In her hand, she carried a polished silver suitcase that gleamed under the bright overhead lights. Her short, silver-streaked hair was styled neatly, radiating the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of experience in high-stakes environments. Today, Amina was bound for New York City, where she would be honored with the Liberty Medal of Excellence, an award recognizing her exceptional contributions to national intelligence. The airport buzzed with life. Announcements echoed over the speakers, blending with the hum of chatter and the rhythmic sound of rolling suitcases. Amina's calm and composed presence naturally drew attention as she moved gracefully through the terminal. It wasn't just her striking appearance, but the way she carried herself, confident, elegant, and with an air of quiet importance. But while most glanced at her with curiosity or admiration, not all gazes were warm. As Amina approached the security checkpoint, she met Olivia Barnes, a security officer with keen eyes and a professional stance. Olivia had encountered suspicious luggage in the past, incidents that left her overly cautious. When Olivia's gaze landed on Amina's shimmering suitcase, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. Olivia carefully examined Amina's passport and boarding pass. Everything appeared in order, but her eyes repeatedly drifted to the suitcase. Though Amina's documentation and behavior showed no sign of irregularity, Olivia's unease lingered. After a brief internal debate, Olivia discreetly radioed her team, expressing mild concerns. She had no solid evidence, just a gut feeling that something wasn't right. Amina, fully aware of Olivia's lingering stare, chose not to acknowledge it. She had been through this routine countless times before. The long, scrutinizing glances, the hushed murmurs, it was an experience she had learned to endure. With steady steps, she continued toward the boarding gate, her head held high, exuding the same unshaken grace. However, beneath the surface, Olivia's subtle actions had set in motion a ripple effect, one that would slowly escalate, casting a shadow over what should have been an ordinary flight. Amina's heels clicked softly against the polished tile floor as she approached the gate, the surrounding travelers lost in their own worlds. Though she kept her composure, Amina sensed the weight of Olivia's suspicion lingering behind her, silently following her every step. Still, years of navigating pressure-filled situations had taught Amina the value of patience and silence. The moment she boarded the aircraft, Amina entered the tranquil space of the first-class cabin. Plush leather seats, warm ambient lighting, and the quiet hum of soft music created a peaceful atmosphere. Carefully, she placed her silver suitcase in the overhead bin, each movement deliberate and precise. As she settled into her seat, she noticed a few fleeting glances from other passengers, but chose to dismiss them, redirecting her focus to a small notebook in her lap. Calmly, she began drafting notes for the speech she would soon deliver. Toward the back of the cabin, Natalie Pierce, the lead flight attendant, observed the passengers with her usual diligence. A seasoned professional, Natalie was known for her strong sense of responsibility and sharp instincts. But beneath her polished exterior lay a persistent sense of unease, the result of previous flights where minor suspicions led to major disruptions. Natalie's eyes were drawn to Amina, noting the flawless suit and the gleaming suitcase tucked away above her seat. Amina didn't fit the mold of Natalie's typical first-class passengers, business executives, celebrities, or those flaunting extravagant wealth. There was something about Amina's quiet confidence that unsettled Natalie, though she couldn't pinpoint why. As she passed by, Natalie smiled politely and asked, "Can I get you anything, Miss Reynolds?" Amina looked up, her calm eyes meeting Natalie's. Her reply was soft but firm. "No, thank you." Though Amina's response was polite, the unwavering confidence behind it left Natalie feeling unexpectedly defensive. Returning to the galley, Natalie caught the eye of Ryan, a junior flight attendant busy preparing the meal service. She lowered her voice, leaning in. "Did you notice the woman in 2A? The one with the silver suitcase?" Natalie whispered. Ryan glanced up briefly but shrugged. "Yeah, I saw her. Probably just work gear. You know how first-class passengers can be. Some carry instruments or tech equipment. I wouldn't worry about it." But Natalie's concern didn't fade. Memories of prior incidents flooded her mind, luggage searched, hidden items uncovered, and situations that escalated unexpectedly. "I don't know," Natalie murmured. "Something feels off." Ryan chuckled lightly, patting her arm. "Relax, Nat. Sometimes a suitcase is just a suitcase." Yet despite Ryan's reassurances, Natalie's eyes frequently wandered back to Amina as she quietly jotted notes in her notebook. And though Amina appeared serene, she could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere around her, like a storm waiting to break. Natalie Pierce couldn't shake the feeling. The polished silver suitcase in the overhead bin glinted under the cabin lights, an unwelcome reminder that her instincts were screaming at her. As lead flight attendant, Natalie had dealt with her fair share of unusual passengers, some harmless, others far less so. But something about Amina Reynolds felt different. The composed, confident demeanor, the quiet, observant eyes. It wasn't just the suitcase. It was the way Amina seemed so calm, as if she knew something no one else did. Natalie's unease deepened each time she passed through the first-class cabin. Her eyes drifted toward Amina, lingering for just a moment too long. Amina noticed. She didn't need to look up to feel the weight of Natalie's gaze. Years in intelligence had sharpened her awareness, and subtle surveillance was not unfamiliar to her. Amina remained still, focusing on the notes she was writing, but her senses stayed sharp. To Natalie, Amina's calmness wasn't reassuring. It was unsettling. The more composed Amina appeared, the more Natalie convinced herself that something was being hidden. Later, as Natalie walked back to the galley, she couldn't hold it in any longer. She found Ryan arranging trays for the meal service. "There's something strange about the woman in 2A, Natalie said in a hushed voice, glancing over her shoulder as if Amina might overhear. "That suitcase of hers, it's too unusual. I can't stop thinking about it." Ryan gave her a patient look, clearly used to Natalie's cautious nature. "Nat, it's just a suitcase. Maybe she's carrying work equipment or something valuable. You know how first-class travelers are. Some of them carry prototypes or confidential stuff." "But her whole vibe is different," Natalie pressed. "She barely speaks, keeps her head down, and she's guarding that thing like it's gold." Ryan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're overthinking it. Trust me. She looks like she's just here to get where she's going." But Natalie wasn't reassured. Her mind cycled through the incidents she'd experienced in the past. Passengers with strange packages, quiet warnings ignored until it was too late. The thought that haunted her most was simple. What if I'm right? In her seat, Amina caught glimpses of Natalie's concern. Each time the flight attendant passed, her gaze lingered a little longer. Amina could see the doubt building, but she chose to remain composed. Reacting would only escalate the situation. Still, the tension was growing, silent but palpable. Unable to suppress her concern any longer, Natalie made her way to the cockpit. Captain Daniel Ross was focused, guiding the aircraft smoothly through the skies. He glanced at Natalie with a faint smile as she knocked gently on the cockpit door. "Everything all right, Natalie?" he asked, sensing the slight tension in her eyes. Natalie stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I think we might have a problem, Captain. The woman in seat 2A, she's carrying a metal suitcase that doesn't sit right with me. I've spoken to her, and she's polite, but something about the way she's handling it makes me nervous." Captain Ross's brow furrowed slightly. "Is there any reason to suspect she's dangerous? Has she done anything specific?" "No," Natalie admitted reluctantly. "But she's too calm, like she's hiding something." Ross sighed, leaning back in his seat. "Natalie, we can't disturb a passenger just because of a feeling. You know the rules. If there's no evidence of a threat, we can't justify pulling her aside." Natalie's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "I understand. I just thought I should bring it to your attention." Ross softened his tone. "I appreciate it, but let's wait until we land. If you're still uneasy, report it to security then. Until there's something concrete, we let things be." Natalie left the cockpit feeling conflicted. She respected the captain's decision, but the tension gnawed at her. Returning to the cabin, her eyes once again locked onto Amina's suitcase, its surface reflecting the dim cabin lights. As the plane began its descent toward Kennedy International Airport, Natalie leaned toward one of her colleagues. "I'm going to alert airport security the moment we land," she whispered. "I can't shake this feeling. Something's not right." Ryan shot her a wary glance, but didn't argue. He'd seen Natalie's instincts pay off before, though this time he doubted there was anything more than nerves involved. The plane descended smoothly through the clouds, but Natalie's heart remained uneasy. What she didn't realize was that her suspicion, not Amina's actions, was quietly steering the flight toward an outcome neither of them could predict. As the plane touched down smoothly at Brighton International Airport, the cabin hummed with quiet anticipation. Amina Reynolds remained seated, calm but aware. She could feel the weight of the attention slowly gravitating toward her. Natalie Pierce, the lead flight attendant, sat stiffly near the front, gripping the edge of her tray. Despite Ryan's persistent urging to let it go, Natalie had alerted airport security. The intercom crackled to life. Captain Daniel Ross's steady voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, for security purposes, we ask all passengers to remain seated after landing. A minor matter needs to be addressed before disembarkation. Thank you for your cooperation." The tension in the cabin tightened. Whispers drifted through the rows, passengers exchanging curious glances. Amina's gaze didn't waver, but she knew. Moments later, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the rear of the plane. 4 uniformed airport officers stepped into the cabin. One of them, with a firm and authoritative tone, announced, "Passenger in seat 2A, please stand up. We need to inspect your luggage." Amina slowly rose, her eyes sweeping the cabin. Every gaze fixed on her, a mix of confusion and quiet judgment. A man a few rows back leaned toward his companion. "She looks suspicious," he murmured under his breath. Ignoring the murmurs, Amina calmly retrieved her silver suitcase from the overhead bin. Without hesitation, she followed the officers down the narrow aisle. Her posture remained poised, every step steady. Natalie watched silently as Amina disappeared beyond the cabin door. A pang of doubt flickered in her chest. In the stark, fluorescent-lit inspection room, Amina set her suitcase on the table as instructed. The officers circled her with quiet authority. Natalie had been called in to confirm her suspicions. She stood at the back of the room, her palms clammy and her heart racing. One officer, his tone flat, gestured to the case. "Please open it, ma'am." Amina keyed in the lock combination with a practiced hand. The lid clicked open, revealing a velvet-lined interior. Nestled inside was the Liberty Medal of Excellence, its gold surface catching the harsh overhead lights. Beside it, a signed certificate bearing the seal of the President of the United States rested neatly. Silence swallowed the room. One officer leaned forward, his eyes wide. He blinked in disbelief. This is real?" he mumbled. "Yes," Amina responded, her voice unwavering. "I was awarded this medal for my contributions to national intelligence, and now I would like to know why I've been treated as a threat." Natalie's face drained of color, her gaze fixed on the medal. The weight of her misjudgment settled heavily on her shoulders. One officer, visibly embarrassed, stepped forward. "We deeply apologize, Miss Reynolds. This was purely procedural." Amina raised a hand, cutting him off. "No, this wasn't procedure," she said, her tone sharp yet quiet. "You acted on assumptions, on prejudice, and because of that, you didn't just humiliate me, you disrupted my work." Amina's eyes flicked to Natalie, whose head lowered under the gaze. In that moment, Natalie realized how far she had allowed fear and bias to guide her actions. "I didn't mean to," Natalie began, her voice small. "It doesn't matter what you meant," Amina interjected calmly. "What matters is what you did. Intentions don't erase the harm caused." The room remained heavy with the weight of her words. Amina's gaze softened just slightly, but her poise held firm. She turned toward the lead officer. "You've searched the suitcase. Now, I expect an explanation as to why this happened, in front of every passenger on that plane." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "We were acting on a report from the flight crew." Amina's eyes narrowed as she glanced toward Natalie. "Do not hide behind protocol," Amina said, her voice like steel. "This wasn't about my suitcase. It was about me. Can you know it?" Natalie's throat tightened. Every doubt she had ignored now pressed against her chest, undeniable. Amina stepped forward slightly, addressing Natalie directly. "Have you ever been judged before speaking a word? Have you felt the weight of someone's gaze questioning your very presence?" Amina's voice was calm, but each word struck with precision. "Because I have, over and over again." Natalie could only nod weakly, shame written across her face. "You thought I was different. and not in a way that fit into your comfort zone. Amina continued. But I was there for a reason. I earned that seat. Natalie's hands clenched at her sides. She felt exposed, each unspoken bias reflected back at her. You didn't think, Amina said softly, but you should have. Natalie swallowed hard, unable to meet Amina's gaze. I'm sorry, Natalie whispered, the words feeling insufficient even as they left her lips. Amina stood silently for a moment before finally offering a measured response. Apology is the first step, she said, but change requires action. I hope you recognize that. The room remained hushed as Amina carefully closed the suitcase and lifted it with quiet grace. She cast one final glance at Natalie before stepping toward the exit. The soft click of the door behind her echoed louder than any words exchanged in the room. Amina Reynolds' gaze remained locked on Natalie Pierce, the flight attendant whose actions had brought them both to this cold, fluorescent-lit room. The suitcase lay open between them, the Liberty Medal of Excellence shimmering under the harsh lights. Natalie's breath hitched as Amina's words pierced through the silence. You thought I didn't belong there, didn't you? Amina's voice was calm but relentless, not because of the suitcase, but because of me. I wasn't the kind of first-class passenger you expected. Natalie swallowed hard, her lips parting, but no words emerged. Amina's stare felt like a mirror, reflecting the bias Natalie had quietly justified in her mind. Amina's voice softened, but carried an undeniable weight. Do you know what hurts the most? She asked. Her tone measured. It's that I've been dealing with this for as long as I can remember. I've learned to endure it. But that doesn't make it right. Every suspicious glance, every whisper, each one chips away at dignity. Natalie's head dipped, guilt pressing down on her shoulders. I didn't mean to, Natalie stammered. Her voice wavered under the heavy truth. Amina's gaze didn't shift. Maybe not, she replied, her voice steady. But you did it. Intentions don't erase the harm you cause. Natalie nodded slowly, her fingers tightening into fists at her sides. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't realize. Amina let the words hang in the air. Silence stretched between them until Natalie felt bare, as if every layer of defense she had crafted was stripped away. Finally, Amina exhaled softly. Apology is a beginning, she said, but change, real change, requires more. Are you willing to do that? Not just for yourself, but for everyone around you? Natalie's eyes lifted to meet Amina's, this time with sincerity. She nodded. I am. Amina studied her for a moment longer, searching for something deeper than remorse. Though she saw honesty, she knew time would reveal whether Natalie's words held weight. As the officers shifted uncomfortably nearby, Amina straightened, closing the suitcase with quiet resolve. The medal, once a symbol of achievement, now felt like something heavier, a reminder of the responsibility she carried, not just for herself, but for others. Without another word, she stepped out of the security room, leaving behind the sterile air and muted apologies. The warm afternoon light bathed the airport as Amina exited, her head held high. But inside, frustration simmered beneath the surface. The car ride home felt distant. The streets of downtown Brighton blurred past as Amina gazed out the window, her thoughts looping endlessly. Natalie's lingering stares, the silent judgment of passengers, the officer's embarrassed apology, each moment played back in slow motion. This wasn't an isolated event. It was part of something bigger, and Amina knew it. When she arrived at her townhouse, the familiar scent of lavender greeted her. A candle flickered softly in the corner, but the comfort she typically found in her quiet space felt muted. She placed the suitcase on her desk, the polished metal reflecting the glow of the lamp. Amina carefully opened it again, letting her eyes rest on the metal inside. What once evoked pride now stirred frustration. The symbol of recognition, meant to celebrate her contributions, seemed to highlight the disparity between what she had achieved and how society perceived her. As she sat in silence, her phone buzzed. The name on the screen brought a rare smile to her lips. David Monroe, an old mentor and close friend. Amina exhaled and answered. Amina, David's warm, familiar voice greeted her. I just heard about what happened. Are you okay? Leaning back in her chair, Amina let out a slow breath. I'm fine, she replied, though exhaustion lingered in her tone. But this can't just pass quietly, David. It's not just me. This is bigger than that. David paused on the other end, his thoughtful silence speaking volumes. You're right, he finally said. His voice carried the same steady resolve that had guided Amina through the early days of her career. It's not personal, it's systemic. But if anyone can turn this into something meaningful, it's you. Amina's gaze drifted to the open suitcase once more. Channel this, David continued. Turn your anger into action. Let this be the start of something greater. His words ignited a familiar spark within her. Straightening in her seat, Amina's fingers hovered over the keyboard of her laptop. You're right, she said, nodding to herself. It can't stop here. As the call ended, Amina's resolve solidified. She began typing, recounting the events at the airport with meticulous detail. But it wasn't just a recounting. It was a blueprint for change. She outlined the subtle but dangerous biases she faced, the failure of airport staff to challenge their assumptions, and the humiliating experience that unfolded as a result. But Amina didn't stop at her personal story. She delved deeper, addressing systemic gaps in airline procedures. Point by point, she proposed solutions. Unconscious bias training for airline staff, mandatory, not optional. Transparency and accountability, ensuring passengers are not singled out based on appearances alone. Protocols for oversight, requiring concrete evidence, not vague suspicion. Amina's words flowed late into the night, each paragraph carrying the weight of years spent navigating prejudice with grace. As she saved the document, her eyes once again fell on the suitcase. Tonight, it wasn't just a container for the metal. It was a symbol of the work ahead. Amina Reynolds's gaze locked on to Natalie Pierce, who stood frozen under the weight of her own guilt. The inspection room remained unnervingly silent. The hum of fluorescent lights, the only sound filling the space. You thought I was out of place, didn't you? Amina's voice broke through the silence, calm but unwavering. Her eyes never left Natalie's face. It wasn't the suitcase. It was me. I didn't look like the first-class passengers you're used to seeing, and that made you uncomfortable. Natalie bit her lip, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She couldn't deny it. Amina took a slow breath, her composure never wavering, but each word carried the weight of years of similar encounters. You never thought to ask if maybe I belonged there. If maybe I earned that seat. Natalie's head lowered, shame pressing down on her like a heavy fog. What hurts most, Amina continued, her tone soft but laced with emotion, is that I've faced this all my life. I've grown used to it, but that doesn't make it hurt any less. Every glance, every whisper, every baseless assumption, each one chips away at my dignity. Natalie's voice trembled as she finally found the courage to speak. I didn't mean to. It doesn't matter what you meant, Amina interrupted gently, though her eyes remained piercing. Your intentions don't erase the harm your actions caused. Natalie's throat tightened and she nodded weakly. I'm sorry. I didn't realize. I didn't think. Amina studied her carefully, letting the silence linger between them. It wasn't enough. She wasn't looking for a simple apology. Natalie needed to feel the weight of her actions, to fully grasp the damage her assumptions had caused. I understand that you didn't think, Amina said quietly, but from now on, you have to. This isn't just about me. It's about the next person who looks like me, the next passenger who gets pulled aside for no reason other than your discomfort. Natalie swallowed hard, her eyes glassy. I will do better, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of remorse. Amina gave a faint nod, her gaze softening, but only slightly. An apology is a start, Amina replied, but the real test is whether you let this change you, not just for yourself, but for others. Natalie nodded earnestly, but Amina knew words could only go so far. Change would take time. The room felt heavy as Amina collected her suitcase and turned to leave. The airport officers avoided eye contact, their expressions strained with guilt. As Amina stepped into the hallway, the afternoon light from the terminal windows flooded over her. Her steps were steady, but inside, frustration and exhaustion churned. The sun dipped low over the skyline as Amina's car weaved through the streets of New York City. Despite the golden light washing over the buildings, Amina barely noticed. She gazed out the window, the events at the airport replaying in her mind like a slow-motion reel. Natalie's lingering glances, the murmurs of the other passengers, the weight of the officers' embarrassed apologies. It wasn't just about her. She knew that. This incident wasn't isolated. It was part of something far greater, far deeper. By the time Amina stepped into the quiet of her townhouse, the sun had nearly set. The soft scent of lavender drifted from a candle on the entryway table, but even that familiar comfort couldn't ease the weight pressing on her heart. She carried the silver suitcase into her study, setting it down on her desk. The reflection from the lamp flickered across its polished surface. Inside, the Liberty Medal of Excellence lay exactly as it had in the inspection room, the certificate beside it still bearing the president's signature. A symbol of achievement, a symbol of respect. Yet tonight it felt heavier. Amina sat down in her leather chair, exhaling slowly as she stared at the suitcase. The award was meant to represent her years of dedication and sacrifice, but instead, it raised painful questions about how that work was perceived by others. Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of her phone. She glanced at the screen. James Parker. Amina's lips curled into a faint smile. James, an old friend and longtime mentor, rarely called without reason, she answered, leaning back in her chair. Amina? James's warm, familiar voice greeted her. I just heard what happened at the airport. Are you all right? Amina's eyes drifted toward the window, the city lights shimmering beyond the glass. I'm fine, James, she replied, though fatigue colored her voice. But this can't just pass. It's not just me. I know too many others who've been through this. James paused as if carefully considering his words. When he spoke, his tone was steady but encouraging. You're right. This isn't personal. It's systemic. And if anyone can push for change, it's you. Amina felt a small flicker of warmth at his faith in her. Turn this into action, Amina, James continued. Let this be the beginning, not the end. His words lit something within her. Amina sat up straighter, her grip tightening on the phone. Thank you, James, she said softly. I think you're right. As the call ended, Amina felt a wave of determination settle over her. She opened her laptop, the screen illuminating her face in the darkened room. Line by line, she began to write. The incident, the assumptions, the apologies that weren't enough. But Amina didn't stop there. She outlined the larger issue, the quiet, persistent bias that shaped experiences like hers every day. She detailed solutions, mandatory bias training, clearer security policies, greater accountability within airline staff. Her words carried the weight of not just her own voice, but the voices of countless others who had been dismissed, judged, and silenced. As she typed, the suitcase beside her glimmered softly under the lamp, a reminder that her fight was far from over. Amina Reynolds sat by the window of her study, the silver suitcase resting quietly on the desk beside her. A sliver of afternoon sunlight streamed across the room, reflecting faintly off the metal inside. The events at the airport still lingered in her mind, not as isolated moments, but as echoes of a far greater issue. 3 days later, her phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name Senator Richard Caldwell. Caldwell was a well-respected figure, known for his relentless advocacy for equality and civil rights reform. Recently, he had been spearheading efforts to draft legislation aimed at eliminating bias within the airline industry, the Passenger Fairness Act. Amina answered with curiosity. Miss Reynolds, Caldwell's deep voice greeted her warmly. I heard what happened at Brighton International. I believe your experience sheds light on something we can no longer ignore. Amina leaned back in her chair, listening intently. The bill I'm drafting, Caldwell continued, seeks to hold airlines accountable for discriminatory practices and strengthen training for staff. Your story could make all the difference. Amina's eyes narrowed with purpose. What can I do to help? Caldwell's tone shifted with quiet conviction. Testify. Share your story during the upcoming hearing. I believe you can sway those still on the fence. Amina's heart pounded, but she felt ready. I'll be there. On the day of the hearing, Amina arrived at the Capitol building, clutching the silver suitcase as she stepped inside. The corridors bustled with activity, senators, reporters, and staff moving with intent. When Amina entered Caldwell's office, she found herself drawn to the historical photos and framed awards adorning the walls. Senator Caldwell greeted her with a firm handshake. Miss Reynolds, he said, his silver hair catching the light, your courage today will resonate beyond these walls. Thank you for being here. Amina nodded. It's time. The congressional hearing room buzzed with anticipation. Camera flashes punctuated the air as Amina walked to the witness stand. The room was packed. Reporters, politicians, and representatives from major airlines sat in stiff rows, awaiting the session to begin. Senator Caldwell opened with a commanding voice. Today, we're not just reviewing legislation. We're addressing dignity, the fundamental right of every passenger to travel without the weight of prejudice. His gaze swept across the room. We will hear from someone whose experience highlights why this reform is necessary. Amina rose, carrying the silver suitcase to the stand. She set it gently beside her and took a steady breath. Honorable Senators, she began, her voice firm but warm. I'm here today not just for myself, but for the countless others who've been judged unfairly. People who, because of their appearance, gender, or background, were treated as suspicious before they ever spoke a word. Her words hung in the air as she recounted the events at the airport, Natalie's lingering glances, the whispers of other passengers, and the quiet humiliation as officers inspected her belongings in front of strangers. This isn't just my story, she said, her voice trembling slightly. It's a reflection of the experiences of so many others. Those who fit outside the narrow molds of expectation, and unless we act, this cycle will continue. A hush filled the room. Amina's gaze locked onto the senators before her, unwavering. We have an opportunity to reshape this system, to ensure fairness isn't selective, but universal. I urge you not to let this moment pass. As Amina returned to her seat, the room remained silent for a beat. Then, one senator began to clap, slowly joined by others until the entire room echoed with applause. After the hearing, Caldwell approached Amina, pride etched into his features. You didn't just speak, he said, shaking her hand. You moved this room. Amina smiled faintly but knew the road ahead remained long. This is just the beginning. In the following days, Amina's testimony rippled across the country. Major news outlets broadcast her words, and social media platforms overflowed with support. But not all responses were positive. She's exaggerating, one comment read. The airline was just doing their job. Why turn it into a national issue? Another post dismissed the incident outright. People are too sensitive. This wasn't about race. Security is security. Amina wasn't surprised. Misunderstanding and doubt were familiar adversaries. But nestled between the criticisms were messages that reaffirmed her mission. I've been through something similar, one woman wrote. Thank you, Amina Reynolds, for speaking up. You represent so many of us. Amina scrolled through each comment, drawing strength from the voices of those who related to her experience. She leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting toward the suitcase on her desk. There was work to be done, and she was ready for it. Amina Reynolds sat at her desk, reading through the countless messages flooding her inbox. Each one told a familiar story. Passengers singled out, scrutinized, or humiliated for reasons that had nothing to do with security. One message caught her attention. I was once pulled aside at security because I didn't look like I belonged in first class, the message read. Thank you, Miss Reynolds, for standing up for all of us. Amina exhaled deeply, letting the words sink in. She felt the collective weight of those she represented. Yet she knew that a movement like this required more than just her voice. The next morning, a new email appeared in her inbox. The subject line was simple, you should read this. Attached was a link to a social media post by a passenger from the same flight, someone who had witnessed everything unfold. The post opened with, I was on that flight. I saw everything. It's time I speak up. The author, a young entrepreneur named Malik Johnson, detailed the incident, describing how flight attendant Natalie Pierce had watched Amina closely from the moment she boarded. Amina Reynolds did nothing wrong. The post read, she was targeted because of bias, plain and simple. I sat a few rows behind her, and I can confirm this was not a security issue. It was prejudice, and it shouldn't happen to anyone. The post spread rapidly, amassing thousands of shares and comments. People flooded social media with messages of support, praising Malik for stepping forward. It's rare to have a witness confirm these things, one person commented. This just proves Amina was right. Malik's account not only strengthened public support, but put Skybound Airlines, the carrier responsible, under mounting pressure. Journalists began demanding clear answers rather than vague apologies. Natalie Pierce, who had remained silent since the incident, found her name circulating in the media. She watched the backlash unfold, feeling more exposed than she ever imagined. That evening, Amina sent Malik a brief message. "Your words carry more power than you know. Thank you for standing up for justice." Amina no longer felt like she was standing alone. Her story had grown beyond her personal experience. It had become a symbol of a much larger fight. The public pressure finally forced Skybound Airlines to take concrete action. A month after Amina's congressional testimony, the airline announced the rollout of mandatory anti-bias training for all employees. The move was widely applauded, though not everyone welcomed the change. Natalie Pierce received notice that she would be attending the first training session, along with dozens of other crew members. When she arrived at the airline's corporate headquarters, she felt the weight of curious and cautious glances from her colleagues. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with quiet judgment. The session began with a simple but powerful question from the facilitator, a social psychologist named Dr. Lauren Blake. "How many of you have ever made a decision based on your first impression of someone?" A few hands rose hesitantly. After a pause, Natalie raised her own hand. Dr. Blake nodded. "That's natural. Bias isn't something we consciously choose. It's a reflex, but the danger lies in ignoring it and allowing it to shape our decisions." Natalie listened quietly as Dr. Blake shared examples of decision in customer service and security screenings. But what struck Natalie hardest was when Dr. Blake referenced an incident that bore striking similarities to what had happened with Amina. "Imagine this," Dr. Blake said. "A first-class passenger, confident and composed, draws attention, not because of anything they did, but because they don't look like the passengers you're used to seeing. What do you do?" Natalie's breath caught in her throat. She felt as though the spotlight had turned directly on her. Each word replayed the memories of that flight, the suspicious glances, the whispered comments to Ryan, and ultimately, the call to airport security. She hadn't meant to cause harm. But sitting there, Natalie realized that intention didn't erase the damage she'd done. By the end of the session, Natalie left the room quietly, weighed down by the realization of how deeply rooted her biases had been. But for the first time, she also carried something new, a determination to change. Skybound Airlines wasn't the only company feeling the impact of the movement. Across the industry, other carriers began considering similar reforms. However, not everyone agreed. At a closed-door meeting of airline executives and lawmakers, resistance emerged. One executive representing Blue Horizon Air voiced his frustrations. "We're not opposed to fairness," he said, his voice clipped. "But let's be realistic. Implementing these training programs and new protocols will cost millions. Small airlines can't handle that kind of expense. It's going to drive up ticket prices." Senator Richard Caldwell, sitting at the head of the table, narrowed his eyes. "So you're suggesting we accept a system where passengers are humiliated because it's cheaper?" Caldwell's voice was calm, but there was a distinct edge to it. "Tell me, is fairness something we value only when it's convenient?" Amina, seated beside the senator, leaned forward. Her voice was measured but firm. "This isn't about costs," she said. "It's about responsibility. If we let financial excuses prevent change, then we're complicit, and I won't stand by while passengers like me continue to suffer." Her words cast a heavy silence over the room. The battle wasn't over, but Amina knew this was only the beginning, and she was prepared to see it through, no matter how long it took. Amina Reynolds sat silently as the meeting room swirled with debate. Across from her, Senator Richard Caldwell leaned forward, his patience thinning as executives from various airlines voiced their opposition to the proposed reforms. "This will cost millions," one executive from Blue Horizon Air insisted, his tone clipped. "Mandatory oversight, bias training, it's going to strain our resources and drive up ticket prices. Smaller carriers can't absorb this." Senator Caldwell's expression hardened, though his voice remained even. "So you're suggesting we tolerate discrimination because addressing it is expensive?" His eyes narrowed. "Fairness isn't something we uphold when it's convenient." Amina sat beside Caldwell, observing the room carefully. When the senator glanced toward her, she met his gaze and gave him a small nod. Caldwell turned to the gathered airline representatives. "I'd like Miss Reynolds to offer her perspective," he announced. Amina rose to her feet, her silver suitcase resting against the table's edge. She faced the room, her voice calm yet firm. "This isn't just about finances," she began. "It's about dignity and accountability. If we prioritize profits over fairness, we fail not only as businesses, but as leaders in this industry." The room grew still as Amina continued. "People like me, and thousands of others, will continue to endure mistreatment unless we confront these biases head-on. Reform isn't optional, it's essential." For a few long moments, no one spoke. But as expected, the silence soon gave way to resistance. Some executives doubled down, arguing the practicality of widespread change. Amina knew the path forward would not be easy. Yet, as she left the meeting alongside Caldwell, she felt the subtle shift in momentum. Public pressure was building, and airlines were beginning to take notice. Over the following months, Skybound Airlines led the charge by implementing anti-bias training for staff at all levels. Soon after, several other major carriers followed suit, unveiling similar initiatives. Natalie Pierce, once at the center of the incident that sparked this movement, quietly began taking steps toward redemption. She didn't just attend the training sessions, she spoke at them. Natalie recounted her experience, openly acknowledging the assumptions she had made about Amina on that flight. "I let unconscious bias guide my actions," Natalie admitted to her colleagues during one session. "I doubted someone because they didn't fit the image I was used to. That was my failing, and I can't take it back, but I can make sure I never repeat it." From afar, Amina observed these efforts, recognizing Natalie's journey as one of slow but meaningful progress. Still, Amina knew this was only part of the battle. The attitudes that allowed such incidents to happen required persistent effort to dismantle. Months later, at the National Conference on Equity and Respect in Air Travel, Amina was invited to be the keynote speaker. The grand auditorium glowed beneath bright lights as industry leaders, activists, and employees filled the room. Amina spoke with quiet confidence, detailing her experience and emphasizing the importance of cultural shifts within the airline industry. "Fair treatment," she said, "should never depend on who we expect to see in first class or any class." Her speech was met with applause, but the most unexpected moment came as the moderator stepped up to the podium. "We have someone who wishes to speak," the moderator announced. A flight crew member who directly experienced one of the incidents we've discussed today. Please welcome Natalie Pierce. A ripple of whispers filled the room as Natalie walked toward the stage, her face tense with nervous resolve. She glanced briefly at Amina, who watched calmly from the front row. Natalie gripped the microphone and took a breath. "First, I'd like to thank this conference for giving me the opportunity to speak," Natalie began, her voice steadying. "I'm not here to defend my actions. I'm here to acknowledge them." The audience sat silently as Natalie spoke, detailing how her unconscious biases had led to the scrutiny and humiliation Amina endured. "I was wrong," Natalie admitted, "and while I know an apology can't erase what happened, I hope this can be a step toward making things right." Natalie glanced toward Amina. "Miss Reynolds, I want to offer you a public apology. You deserved better that day. I let fear and assumption cloud my judgment. I hope that by sharing my mistake, others in this industry can learn from it." The room remained still as Natalie stepped back. Amina rose from her seat, ascending the stage to face Natalie directly. Their eyes met, not with tension, but with mutual understanding. "I accept your apology," Amina said softly, placing a hand lightly on Natalie's arm. "But remember, change isn't just about apologies, it's about the actions we take moving forward." Turning to the audience, Amina's voice grew resolute. "We can't rewrite the past, but we can shape the future. This fight belongs to all of us. If we commit to learning and unlearning, we can create the fairness and respect that everyone deserves." The room erupted into applause. A standing ovation rippled across the auditorium, resonating not just as praise but as recognition of the larger movement unfolding. As the conference concluded, Amina stepped outside into the cool evening air. Natalie approached her quietly, gratitude flickering behind her eyes. "Thank you," Natalie said, her voice soft but sincere. Amina nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Keep learning, and make sure this isn't the last time you speak up." Natalie smiled faintly. "I will." Watching Natalie walk away, Amina felt a rare sense of lightness. The journey wasn't over, but today marked a turning point. Amina knew that change didn't happen all at once. It happened one person, one action, at a time. And this? This was just the beginning. The hearing room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. All eyes were fixed on the screen at the front, waiting for the final vote tally. Today marked a crucial moment, the culmination of months of relentless work. Alongside Senator Richard Caldwell and a coalition of advocates, Amina had fought tirelessly for the Passenger Fairness Act, a bill designed to combat discrimination in air travel and enforce accountability within the airline industry. As the numbers flashed across the screen, the room erupted into applause. The bill had passed by an overwhelming majority. Amina exhaled slowly, letting the wave of relief settle over her. This victory wasn't just hers, it belonged to everyone who had endured the quiet weight of prejudice and injustice. Senator Caldwell approached, his smile broad and triumphant. "We did it, Miss Reynolds," he said, pride gleaming in his eyes. Amina met his gaze, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is just the start, Senator. Now we ensure it's implemented." Caldwell nodded, knowing she was ripe. Passing a bill was only the beginning of the long road ahead. A few days later, a small envelope arrived at Amina's home. The handwritten address on the front caught her attention. Inside was a simple yet powerful letter. "Dear Miss Reynolds, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Last year my 10-year-old son was treated unfairly at an airport. I didn't know how to speak up, but when I saw you stand and fight, I felt like I had a voice too. Yesterday, I told my son the bill had passed. He smiled and said, 'Now they won't look down on us anymore. Thank you for standing for all of us.'" Amina's fingers brushed lightly over the paper, her heart swelling with emotion. She set the letter carefully on her desk, her gaze drifting to the silver suitcase resting nearby. A quiet reminder of the long journey that had brought her to this point. At that moment, more than ever, she understood the significance of continuing the fight. Weeks later, Amina found herself at Brighton International Airport once more, preparing to board another flight. This time, she wasn't just a passenger. She was traveling as an advisor to the newly established Aviation Equity Commission, a direct product of the reforms she had helped shape. As she waited at the gate, she noticed a young boy and his mother nearby. The boy's eyes widened as he spotted her, recognition lighting up his face. Amina knelt slightly and smiled. "You're the reason I keep doing this," she said softly, giving him a small wave. The boy's grin grew, and his mother offered a quiet nod of gratitude. As Amina boarded the plane, sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, casting a warm glow over her seat. She settled in, gazing out at the endless blue sky ahead. The journey wasn't over. There was still more work to be done. Countless voices waited to be heard, and the path toward lasting change stretched far beyond the horizon. But Amina knew that with every small step forward, a fairer future was taking shape. As the plane ascended, cutting through the clouds, Amina's heart swelled with quiet resolve. This wasn't just her story. It was a story of hope, of perseverance, and of the limitless possibilities that lay ahead. Amina Reynolds' story serves as a beacon for all who fight for justice and dignity. If you faced injustice or have a story to share, we'd love to hear from you. Let's continue this conversation together. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that can change the world.